In today's video, we will talk about what a grand jury is. Spoiler alert, it's not the same thing as a trial jury. Hello, and welcome to Professor Price. I have been a lawyer for more than 35 years and a full-time professor for more than 10 years. People studying law or criminal justice or working in the legal or law enforcement fields need to know that there are two kinds of juries: grand juries and trial juries. These two types of juries are very different from each other, and they serve different functions in the American criminal justice system. So let's jump right into what is a grand jury. The juries you see in courtrooms, sitting through trials, listening to the testimony and other evidence, and deciding the guilt or innocence of the defendant are not grand juries. There are two types of juries in America: grand juries and trial juries. The trial juries are also called petit juries, which means small juries. But as long as I've been a lawyer, I've almost never heard them in actual practice referred to as petit juries. Defendants in federal prosecutions have a Fifth Amendment right to a grand jury. The purpose of a grand jury is to investigate and make sure that the government has at least a basic case against the defendant before the prosecutor can go forward. In other words, a grand jury is a safeguard to stand between an individual citizen and a potentially overzealous prosecutor or law enforcement system, criminal justice system, that wants to possibly harass someone by filing criminal charges against them and forcing them to go to the expense and time of a trial when it was just made up accusations. The purpose of a grand jury is to make sure that the government has a basic case before making the defendant go through all of that. If the grand jury decides that the prosecutor did meet their burden of proof, the grand jury will issue an indictment. They will indict the defendant on the charge or charges. An indictment is also called a true bill. So if the grand jury decides that the prosecutor did not meet their burden of proof, what the grand jury issues is not an indictment, but something called no true bill. If you think of a jury as something that sits in a courtroom, and the defendant is there, and a judge is there, and witnesses are there, and the prosecutor and defense lawyer, that is not at all what the grand jury process is like. Instead, the grand jury performs its duties in secrecy because they don't want people's names trashed by these things happening in public if, in fact, the prosecutor doesn't really have a valid case. So because they happen in private, the defendant does not participate in the grand jury proceedings. Remember, the grand jury does not decide if someone is guilty or innocent. The grand jury only decides if the prosecutor is allowed to go forward in the process toward trial. And at the trial jury would determine guilt or innocence, not the grand jury. You would not have the same people serving on a trial jury against the defendant who served on the grand jury against the defendant. So if the grand jury does issue an indictment, Then the case against the defendant can eventually go to trial, but it usually is months later, or longer than that. Please hit subscribe and the thumbs up icon if you enjoy this video. Also, please feel free to share this video with people you think could benefit from the information. YouTube uses the number of subscribers, likes, and shares in its algorithm to determine which videos show up in search results, and the higher these videos are in the results, the more people I can help. Thank you. Grand juries, unlike trial juries, do not get selected for specific cases. Instead, the people who serve on grand juries serve for a period of time, like a month or even up to a year, and they evaluate all the cases that come in front of them during that time. In a trial jury, people get a summons to go to court, and they get sent to a specific courtroom when a case is ready for trial, and the prosecution and the defense lawyers will then conduct jury selection, also called voir dire, to select, or more like unselect, the jury for that specific trial. Grand juries are not like that. And grand juries have to continue serving out their period of time, whether it's a month or a year or 6 months or whatever the period is for which they were appointed. Unlike people who serve on trial juries, who, when the trial is over and the judge excuses them, they're, after, of course, deliberations and verdict, after the judge excuses them, they're done and they can go home. That's not the way it is with grand juries. Problems with grand juries. Well, since they do their work behind closed doors, the public might have a lack of trust. Also, the grand jury might be motivated or influenced by current events or by local politics. Another issue is that the prosecutor is supposed to serve as a legal advisor to the grand jury, but in reality, the prosecutor often dominates the grand jury. In other words, a lot of grand juries give great deference to the prosecutor when they argue that the defendant committed a charged crime. The grand jury the grand jury often assumes that the prosecutor knows the law better than they do, so they tend to function as a rubber stamp for the prosecutor. Different states use grand juries in different ways. For example, some states require grand juries for most or all felonies. These states include Alabama, Alaska, Delaware, District of Columbia, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. So those again are the states that require grand juries for most or all felonies. In some states, however, grand juries are optional for most felonies. And those states are on the slide on your screen right now. So in a situation in which a state does not require a grand jury for a felony case to proceed, there would be a pretrial hearing at which the prosecutor would have to establish to the satisfaction of the judge that they had probable cause to establish that a crime was committed and that the defendant committed the crime. So that's the difference between grand juries and trial juries, And remember, trial juries are also sometimes, not often, but sometimes called petit juries. Petit as in small or petite. Please feel free to post in the comments your questions about criminal law or related topics that you would like to see covered in a future video. I cannot provide legal advice about specific cases or situations, but I can offer general information for educational purposes. Law students, paralegal students, criminal justice students, and pre-law students, as well as people working as paralegals or in the criminal justice field, are the main audience for these videos, but everyone is welcome to learn about American law and our legal system. Please remember to subscribe so you can get notifications when I post a new video. Subscribing will not cost you anything, but it can help me to reach and help more people with these educational videos. Thank you. If you liked this video, you might like the next video about disclosing criminal evidence.